Well, welcome everybody. Hope you're having a good Trailhead DX adventure. Today I'm going to talk about going from developer to citizen data scientist using Einstein Discovery. I'm a product manager with the Einstein Discovery team. I may talk about forward-looking statements, so only make purchasing decisions based on what is GA today. So, when you think of machine learning, some of you might remember this movie Terminator, where the machines learned and they took over the world. Well, this is we're very far away from this point because machine learning, at least with Einstein Discovery, most machine learning that you end up with today is nothing more than taking existing historical data that you already have and you run it through some statistical analysis and you build a model, you train the model, and you then deploy that to your production and you see all the data. So we're far away from machines taking over because you own the data, you've got to feed the data into our system and whatnot. So with today's demo, I'm going to show you how you can use Einstein Analytics along with Einstein Discovery. It's all part of Einstein Analytics Plus to actually build some predictive models. So it all starts with your use case. So those of you, actually, how many in the room have Einstein Analytics Plus or are familiar with what that is? Awesome. If you are interested in learning more, we have some developer orgs that have all the licenses. So check us out on Trailhead. You can get a free developer license to check out the entire suite of products within Einstein Analytics Plus. But it's very important that you start with a use case. What is a use case? So, what are you trying to solve for? So, it might be something, are my customers going to attrit? So maybe you have a subscription business, you have a bunch of data on your accounts, and you want to know, are my customers going to attrit? Or maybe something more like your sales cycle. You want to minimize your sales cycle because you want to sell faster. With Einstein Discovery, we can look at Boolean-based fields and number-based fields, and we can make a prediction. That is called linear regression or binary regression. Those are the two types of machine learning that Einstein Discovery can solve today. Eventually, we're going to have more models in the future. But you start with your use case. It's very important you know what that use case is. Because with that use case, you're going to have to make sure that you have data on that use case. When training a model, you have to tell the model what does historical data look like. Because you want to look for the statistics and you want to figure out from these statistics, what is that going to predict in the future? So if we're thinking about whether or not my customers have churned, you've got to have a data set that is, we'll call it your training data set, that has data that says, okay, last year, here's all my customers that I had. Here's a flag that says whether they churned, attrited, true or false. So you have a Boolean-based field that you can then feed into the training model. The biggest part on coming up with a good statistical model or predictive model is actually that data set. So that data prep that you do ahead of time is probably the single most important and the most time-consuming part of building a predictive model. Einstein Analytics has some tools that let you prepare your data. So you can connect to Salesforce, bring in your objects, you can clean your data, you can create calculated fields. Let's say you have a created date and a closed date, and you want to minimize your sales cycle. Well, you got to create a calculated field that is that time between created and closed. So Einstein Analytics data prep tools allow you to build that. So utilize those tools ahead of time. And the next thing is make sure that you don't have anything in your predictive data that actually is telling the model whether or not this is going to happen. So an example is if I'm saying, I want to minimize the occurrences of when churn is true, and I have a field as my input that says, the month of churn, well, that's going to be populated when churn is true, and it's going to be null when there's no churn. So the predictive model is going to say, yeah, I'm just going to look at this field. This is the number one correlating field. I'm going to build you a model that's 100% accurate. Well, as you know, you don't want a model that's 100% accurate. You don't want to kind of have a strong predictor field. I'll get into what that means in a little bit. But you want to make sure that you remove things from your training data set that might be telling the system exactly what the outcome is going to be. Otherwise, you're not going to find any correlations. Once you have that data set, Einstein Discovery, all point and click, will let you pull in that data set. It's going to analyze the data set. It's going to create what's called an Einstein Discovery story. It's going to tell you what happened with your data, why it happened, and it's going to predict what could happen in the future. That's why we call it a story. You, as a user, you can analyze those insights. You can see, does this make sense? You can look at your model metrics to see what is my model accuracy. You can drill in if you're a data scientist already. You might be interested in some of the additional features. And then the last step is you're going to deploy. You're going to operationalize it. So once you've looked at your insights and you're like, yeah, this is a great prediction model. I want this on my data. You deploy it, and then you can actually see the predictions live in Salesforce. So this is what we're going to go over in the demo. I'm going to stop with the slides and go straight into demo. All right, so here I am in my org. What I'm showing you is the summer release. So a couple of the features are only available in the summer release. So you might have to wait till June before this is live in your production or in Trailhead orgs. But here I am. I've got customer data, and I'm tracking some fields. In this case, it's a call center type use case. I'm looking at my customers, and there's multiple, or telecom use case, and there's multiple products that these customers have, and I'm really interested in keeping my customers. It's a subscription-based business, and I have a field that says, see, churn. All right, well, there we go. It's a checkbox field, and then I'm tracking whether they're churned or not. So I have information on all my accounts. It's Salesforce. You should be tracking everything already, and I'm tracking whether or not they've churned or not. So I'm not going to have to do any data prep here. Assume, with your own data, you might have to. In this case, I'm going to go straight into Einstein Analytics, Analytics Studio. Assume I've already brought in my data, so I built a data flow. I connected to my Salesforce data, and I said, give me all my customer information. And so I have a data set called customers. So all that data you saw is now here for 7,000 plus customers. Let's take a look at this first. Let's kind of see what I have. So in Einstein Analytics, we give you some great tools to kind of visualize your data. I'm just looking at a table. So this is the table. So this is kind of the data I have. This is great. You might look at fields like, hey, ID fields. I don't want to analyze trends with any field that's going to be completely unique. It's not going to tell me anything. I should remove. We call that high cardinality. We shouldn't need to include those. I could either exclude it in my data set, or I can do it when I build my story. So let's just show you what that looks like. So I'm going to have a link, create story. Again, this is if I have Einstein Analytics Plus enabled in my org. And we talked about churn. So all the fields in my data set that are numbers or Boolean based, whether they're true, false, 1 or 0, yes, no, anything that just has 2 values is going to show up in this list. Additionally, I might want to look at the rate of occurrence of my data. So this is just there's no model. It's just going to tell me the rate of occurrence. But I'm going to really focus in on that churn. So I've got churn true. And what do I want to do with that? My business outcome is I want to reduce churn. So I want to actually minimize churn. And really all minimize, maximize does is control how the predictive text is going to show up, whether if churn goes down, is that a positive or a negative effect? In this case, we want churn going down to be a positive. So I'm going to minimize churn, and then I'm going to look at my data options. So it's going to show me all my fields here. So I do need to know about my data. So in order to be successful, you have to kind of know what the data is, because if you're just going to analyze everything, you might end up with not a very good predictive model. For instance, if I'm looking at opportunities, well, I only want to analyze my closed opportunities. I want to look at historical data. I want to make sure my data has hit a terminal state. So terminal state is that data is not going to change for the most part. In a churn use case, it's a little bit different, because once the customers churn, sure, that's in a terminal state, but your existing customers may change. So it's a little bit different, but in the most case, you want to look for data that's in a terminal state. And that is a good training data set. Some options I have, I can click on any of my columns. I can see the distribution. I can see all the values. I might not want to do a predictive model, or I might not want to look at this value. I can either bucket it as other, or if I want to filter my data, I can actually ignore. I can say, hey, only include those values within my system. In this case, I'm just going to do everything. So I'm going to create a story. I'm going to just choose everything. Let's assume that I might not know everything about my data, or I think that everything is important. We're not going to wait for this. It only takes a few minutes, but I'm just going to show you an already existing story. In fact, I have an app called Customer Churn. I don't want that. No. Sorry. Let's try that again. All right. So I'm going to go into my stories, because I want to start with the first one that's going to be created. So I mentioned a strong predictor. It's telling the model exactly what's going to happen. Well, if I ever see a field that explains 100% of the variation, that's telling my model that, hey, as long as you have this field, we know 100% of the time whether it's going to churn or not, because I have this field of the month of churn. But Einstein Discovery is very smart. It looks for things like that, and it recommends what to do next. So we have these recommended updates. We call these improvements. So it's going to tell me things like strongest predictors, and it's going to recommend that I ignore month of churn. It's also going to tell me duplicates. So a duplicate is, hey, these two fields are pretty much telling me the identical thing about that model. We can make the model more efficient by removing some of the duplicate fields. We don't make any recommendations because you really have to know your data in order to make the choice of which field to keep or drop. It's always fine to keep the fields. If I go into dominant values, I have a field where 90% of the values are yes. So there's not too much variability in this, and it actually recommends that I only keep the yes value, but really I should ignore it. So I should probably just ignore this field altogether, but I could do nothing. I can always go back to my setup. It's going to also tell me the fields. Anything that I chose in my improvements is already, like, I unchecked this, so it's already unchecked, but I can see kind of duplicate fields. I can always create a new story if I want to. So let's assume that I created a new story. What does that look like? So I've removed my strongest predictor, and now what we've got is contract is explaining the most variation. So it's saying contract actually has the highest correlation to my churn. And I think a business user probably already knows this. They know that their month-to-month customers have a much higher rate of churn. In fact, it's going to tell me, 2-year, if I have a 2-year, that's our best. We only have a 2.9% probability to churn, but month-to-month has a 43% probability to churn. I can do things like I can click into this, and maybe I want to analyze 2-year, or maybe I want to analyze month-to-month. But I can go into each of these fields. I can analyze it further. So what happened, again, it's looking at all my data. It's looking at all the combination. We've run some statistical analysis. So I can see here, you didn't have to do a thing. You just had to feed in the data. And now because you know the data, you can read this and figure out what happened with the data. And then I can see why it happened. So this is actually really, sorry, the resolution is kind of off, so the chart didn't draw very well, so I apologize for that. But the why it happened is actually explaining the entire prediction. So it's saying what each, see if I can fix the resolution here. There we go, it's a little bit better. There we go, much better. So now these are all the factors that are going into the prediction. And it already figured that the linear regression, or the binary regression model that it did in the back end already figured all this stuff out, and it's explaining all the pieces to the prediction. I can go to predictions improvements, and I can do a what if analysis. So now I can say, what if I had a customer that was not a senior citizen, monthly charges between this, total charges, and so on. All the fields that I fed in, I can set as input variables, and it's going to come to a predicted outcome. This is very useful, but it's the what if analysis. I don't want my end users going into this tool and doing what if analysis. I want to run this prediction live on my data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all this. I'm going to say, you know what? I think this is a good model. I want to see how this looks against production data. So I'm going to deploy my model. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to add it to an object. I have a custom object called customers. It's already selected. I'm going to map my fields. So the model input, like I said, there could be calculated fields that you did in your data prep. If those do not exist in Salesforce and they're required for your model, let's say the difference between created date and closed date is a number, well, you're going to need to get that data back in Salesforce because when you get your prediction, you have to have a way to tell the prediction where that data comes from. So in this case, I have all the fields like I already showed you. There's a pilot feature where I can automatically persist that data in Salesforce. There's also a managed package you can use today that customers today are using to persist the data. What I mean by persist is that score, if you want to report on it in Salesforce reporting, you need to have that as a field. So as a pilot in the summer release, you'll be able to persist it without any managed package or code. Today, you need to install a managed package if you're not part of that pilot. This is all in documentation, by the way. And then I can segment my model. So maybe I built a predictive model for a certain segment of my business. I don't want to evaluate all my accounts based on a single model. So I may want to say, hey, I only want to evaluate segments of my data. In this case, I'm just going to do everything. And then I can set up what's called an action variable. So what's great about Einstein Discovery is we're going to give you a prediction, and then we're going to tell you how you can improve that prediction. So an action variable is telling your end users what they could change to make that prediction better. So in the case of churn, let's say a contract is an action variable. Well, it can look at month-to-month customers, and it can say, hey, if you get these guys onto a 2-year contract, we're going to reduce that churn, the predicted churn rate. So I can set up my predictive variables. So because we don't have very much time, I've deployed the model, and then I go back to my record. And I edit the page, and in the summer release, we have a new Lightning component that you can drag and drop, so you can see the predictions on the page. So I have my component, and I want to look at my likelihood to churn model, and I can save that. And now, I see my predictions directly on my record. So when I open the record, it does a real-time API call out to get that prediction and tell me what is my likelihood to churn, and then why the prediction is what it is. So in this case, month to month is or contract is month to month. There's currently a bug where this should actually be green instead of red, but contract month to month is actually bringing down my overall prediction down by 3.55%. Device protection, no, also has an impact, and so on. And then it's telling me how to change it. So by changing the contract to 2-year, I can actually improve it. So let's take a look at that. So I change this to 2-year. It saves. It was supposed to refresh automatically. I don't know why it didn't. And there we go. It changed. Oh, it did. The bug is fixed. Look at that green. That's awesome. So the likelihood to churn dropped from 23% to 7.82%. Now the number that it shows you is a percentage between 0 and 100, and there's a threshold that you have to kind of know to say what does that number mean. So some of the things we're working on in the future is actually instead of showing you a number, potentially even showing you what that value is, whether it's churn, true or false. But for now, we're giving you a threshold, and it's up to you to tell your users what that threshold means. But yeah, so that's Einstein Discovery. That's how you can get your predictions directly on your record. And as I mentioned earlier, the key is that data prep. So make sure your data is good. Feed into the system. Try this out, and I think you can end up with some pretty cool predictions. Thank you.